Okay, so welcome back to Dreams of the High Frontier. Thanks for coming back. In the previous installment, we saw the first stirrings of man's destiny in space, and we saw the launch of Sputnik. In this installment, we see the American reaction to Sputnik, and we see the first American attempt to launch a satellite into orbit. Chapter 2, Washington, D.C., November 1957. The launch of the Russian satellite, now known to be called Sputnik, caught the United States totally off guard. Since the end of the Second World War, the Americans had claimed to be the world leaders in technology and scientific research. In the dying days of the war, the Office of Strategic Services had instituted Operation Paperclip, which had been designed to smuggle large numbers of Nazi scientists out of Europe before they could fall into Russian hands. Among these scientists were Dr. Wernher von Braun and the entire Peenemünde research team. Over the course of the 22 days that Sputnik had broadcast its radio signal all over the United States, people could be seen standing outside night after night watching as the satellite circled the Earth every 96 minutes. How does it stay up there, they asked. Is it spying on us? Are the Russians going to attack us? Ever since the news of Sputnik's launch had been broken by the media, a wave of near hysteria had swept the United States. Now there was talk of a congressional investigation to answer these and other questions. That was where Wernher von Braun found himself now, in front of a congressional committee answering questions about Sputnik and about spaceflight in general. Dr. von Braun, what can you tell us about the rocket that the Russians used to launch their satellite? The Russians used a variant of their R-7 ballistic missile. As you know, the basic model is a suborbital rocket designed to deliver a nuclear warhead to targets up to 10,000 miles away. The rocket used for the Sputnik launch has obviously been modified to be able to place a payload in orbit. In what way has the R-7 been modified? The Sputnik rocket has clearly been modified to fly higher and faster. How exactly does Sputnik stay up there? Through inertia. Through inertia? You mean its own momentum? Yes, replied von Braun. Newton's laws of motion tell us that an object in motion stays in motion. Think of it like this. Imagine that you have a cannon sitting on a flat plane. You fire it, and the shell travels for several miles. The momentum imparted by the gunpowder is not sufficient to overcome the force of gravity. Therefore, the shell will fly for a while and return to Earth. Next, imagine that the cannon is sitting on top of a very high hill. The shell also has a larger charge of gunpowder. As a result, more momentum is imparted, and the shell may travel for 100 miles or more. So, with a sufficiently large force propelling it, a satellite will travel an equal distance in the opposite direction? Yes. Tell me, Dr. von Braun, how is it that Sputnik doesn't simply fly off into the universe? Von Braun paused a moment before answering. The rocket used to launch Sputnik does not have sufficient momentum for that to occur. The speed needed to achieve a stable orbit is 17,500 miles per hour. To leave the gravitational influence of the Earth, you must be going considerably faster. Doctor, what do you think the ultimate goal of the Russian space program is? I think it is the moon, said von Braun. Why is that? Because it is close, and because it could yield tangible benefits both for science and national defense. On what time frame might the Soviets attempt a moon landing? That I cannot say with total certainty, said von Braun. There would be many technological hurdles to overcome in such an enterprise. It would require hardware and materials that have not even been conceived of yet. But I think that with a decade or two of concerted national effort, it would be possible. It would not be easy, but it could be done. What should our response to the Soviets be? We must launch a satellite of our own, replied von Braun promptly. We could have done so a year ago had the Pentagon not interfered. What exactly do you mean by that? I mean the Jupiter-C rocket. You mean the Army's intercontinental ballistic missile? Yes. We conducted a series of nose cone tests to see how they would stand up to the stress of reentry. It would not have been difficult to include a small satellite as a payload. What stopped you? On at least one occasion, observers from the Pentagon came to observe our launches. They told us that they were there to ensure that we did not accidentally launch our rocket into orbit. Evidently, President Eisenhower did not want to antagonize the Russians. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make, Dr. von Braun? Yes. When I designed rockets for the Nazis, they saw them only as weapons. When I and my team escaped from Germany at the end of the war, we took a vow that we would only build rockets for peaceful purposes. The Soviets have made no such promises. If we are to compete with them in this space race, as it has been called, then let us compete with them on our terms. Cape Canaveral, Florida, Launch Complex 18, December 6, 1957, 4:40 p.m. The Vanguard rocket was bathed in the bright Florida sunshine. It was tall and spindly looking and bathed in vapor. Perched atop the rocket under the protective cover of its nose cone was a small satellite, even smaller than Sputnik had been. Like Sputnik, it was silver in color. It had 6 stubby antennas projecting outwards and was powered by several small solar cells. Inside the blockhouse, frantic activity swirled around Dr. John Hagen as the flight controllers prepared for launch. Hagen keyed his mic and spoke into the flight director's loop. "Attention all flight controllers. Let's go around the horn one last time for go, no go. Booster, go flight. Fido. Fido is go flight. Guido, guidance is go. FAO, FAO is go. Tracking, tracking is go. Telemetry, go. Meteorological, go. All flight controllers, this is flight. We are go for launch. Commencing final countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hagen flipped up a clear plastic cover and pushed a large red button underneath. It depressed with an audible click. Fire. On the pad several hundred yards away, the Vanguard rocket began to rise upward on a pillar of fire. Then something seemed to go wrong, because the rocket settled back down onto the pad, toppled sideways, and exploded. Chapter 3, late 1957. The cause of the Vanguard TV-3 explosion was never determined with certainty, but an examination of the wreckage indicated that the accident had occurred as a result of a failure in the first stage turbopump. As a result, the fuel supply had been cut off and the rocket fell back onto the pad due to the lack of thrust. Even though the rocket only fell a few feet, the impact was sufficient to upset the rocket's center of gravity and damage the fuel system. As a result, the Vanguard rocket fell over and exploded. The 1-pound satellite that the Vanguard rocket was intended to send into space survived the initial explosion and was found still functioning on the concrete apron surrounding the launch pad. However, it was sufficiently heavily damaged that it was deemed to be unsalvageable. While the United States had been recovering from the embarrassment of Vanguard, the Soviets saw fit to add insult to injury with the launch of Sputnik 2. Unlike Sputnik, which was a simple satellite with only a few primitive instruments, Sputnik 2 was more ambitious. In addition to its suite of scientific instruments, Sputnik 2 also carried a dog named Laika. Even though she died of stress and overheating 6 hours into the flight, the achievement of sending a life form into space was a significant one. The Americans were now 2 steps behind and racing to catch up. It was clear that the Russians would next attempt to launch a capsule, not with a dog, but with a cosmonaut. Cape Canaveral, Florida, Launch Complex 26, January 31st, 1958, 10:48 p.m. The gantry rolled slowly back from the Juno rocket. It was nighttime, and the rocket was bathed in the harsh glare of bright floodlights. The gantry stopped moving when it was 200 yards away from the launch pad. The rocket stood by itself in the balmy Florida night. In spite of the warmth of the night, it was wreathed in frigid-looking vapor and coated in a sheet of ice. Even though it was more than 80 degrees outside, internally, the rocket's temperatures hovered at somewhere around -100. This was thanks to its liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuels, which had to be kept in a cryogenic state in order to ensure that they would flow through the fuel system properly. A voice over a loudspeaker said, "Attention! All personnel clear the pad and retreat to the blockhouse. Stand by for final pre-flight checks." There followed a number of different voices over the loudspeaker confirming the readiness of the rocket's internal systems and the status of the Explorer 1 satellite. Fuel tank chill-down sequence complete. Copy that. Requesting primary power bus status. Primary power bus is A-OK. Stand by for guidance computer check. Roger, standing by. Guidance computer checks at 100%. Proceeding with engine gimbal test. Understood. Engine gimbal looks good. All flight controllers report go, no go for launch. After several minutes, the flight director came on again. "We are go for launch." A voice began to count backwards from T-minus 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was a loud whoosh, and bright flames spewed out from under the launch pad. A second later, the lockdown clamps holding the rocket to the pad released, and the rocket leapt off the pad on a column of fire and soared into the night sky. The world seemed to fall away as the rocket bearing Explorer 1 sped higher and higher. From the ground, the rocket seemed to quickly disappear among the stars. At an altitude of 20 miles, the first stage was jettisoned and went spinning away into the night to land somewhere in the ocean. 3 small rocket motors fired briefly to push the spacecraft away from the tumbling first stage. A second or two later, the second stage motors kicked in and began to power the rocket through the upper reaches of the atmosphere. At 60 miles, the second stage was spent, and it too fell away to burn up in the atmosphere. The third stage glided silently into orbit. A few minutes after that, the rotating drum containing the satellite was ejected from the nose cone of the spacecraft. The drum cracked open, and Explorer 1 was jettisoned from the rocket. It soared into the vacuum, with the Earth turning placidly below. Washington, D.C., the White House, July 29, 1958. President Eisenhower sat behind his desk in the Oval Office and allowed the frenetic activity to swirl around him. A TV camera stood in the middle of the room. It was flanked by a pair of large portable lights pointed at the president's desk. In between the president's desk and the camera, low down and out of the camera's field of view, was a collection of microphones. Around the edges of the room was a gaggle of print reporters armed with pens and notepads. 30 seconds, Mr. President. The light on the camera began to blink. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Eisenhower stared into the camera and began to speak. My fellow Americans, I am coming before you tonight to speak to you about the events of the last few months. As you are no doubt aware, some months ago, the Soviet Union launched a missile into space. In the nose cone of this missile was a satellite, a tiny spacecraft with a radio transmitter and a few primitive scientific instruments. The satellite was harmless, designed only to gather scientific data. Even though the satellite was harmless, its launch represents a dangerous escalation in the ideological conflict we find ourselves locked in with the Soviets. A missile that can launch a satellite into space can also bring death to our shores. Unlike the Soviet Union, the United States is not an aggressor nation. On behalf of the American people, I pledge to devote American space activities to peaceful purposes, to scientific exploration, and to the furthering of mankind. It is for these reasons that earlier today I signed into law the National Air and Space Act. This act will bring together all civilian space activities in the United States under a single organization, whose sole goal is to explore in peace and to develop space for the benefit of all humankind. It is my express hope that we can do so in peace and cooperation with all the peoples of the world. Thank you, and God bless America. Okay, so that includes this installment of Dreams of the High Frontier. You can like, comment, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter. And I'd like to thank you for listening and say see you next time.